The explosion came without warning. One moment FOB Ridgecrest was quiet, the particular quiet of a Montana winter morning where cold sits so deep and still that sound itself seems frozen in place. The next moment, the north perimeter fence tore apart like paper. The chain link curled back in a shape that didn't look real, didn't look like something physics could produce, and two soldiers went down before the echo of the blast had finished rolling across the valley. Then the radio died. Captain Grant Kessel grabbed the handset and got nothing. Static. Not broken static, not intermittent static, the flat uniform, deliberate static of something switched off by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He switched frequencies. Same result. Switched again. The base alarm began screaming, and the smoke started rising from the north fence. And through the smoke came the sound of sustained automatic fire, the rhythmic hammer of a belt-fed weapon working through a long burst, and beneath that, the flatter crack of rifle fire from multiple positions up the ridge. 3 soldiers were down on the north side of the compound. One was not moving, another was crawling, one hand dragging in the snow, leaving a dark line behind him. The third, Brett Linden, 22 years old and red-eyed from an overnight watch, lay near the gate where he had been standing 90 seconds earlier with a paper cup of coffee. Grant Kessel stood in the doorway of the command trailer and looked at his base and understood in the practiced way of a man who had spent 2 decades in uniform that the situation was very bad. Then a single shot rang out from the south ridge. Clean, measured, coming from behind him, from the elevated rock face on the opposite side of the compound from the attack. A direction nobody was watching, a direction nobody had reason to watch. He turned. The incoming fire from the north stuttered. The heavy weapon that had been hammering the perimeter fell silent. 1 second, 2, 3. The defenders along the secondary line raised their heads, confused and disbelieving. A second shot followed the first. Grant Kessel stood in the Montana cold and tried to understand what he was hearing. Who was on the south ridge? Who had climbed up there while the attack was already underway? Who was shooting back when every person on this base had been accounted for and pinned down? He didn't know yet. He would. 6 hours earlier, his wife had signed her name in the visitor log. The drive up from Billings takes about 3 hours on a good day, longer in winter when the state highways narrow and the shoulder disappears under compacted snow. Nora Kessel had left before first light, the kind of early departure that requires no alarm because you were not really sleeping anyway. She had driven with the heat on high and the radio off, watching the sky move from black to dark blue to the pale gray of a winter Montana dawn, and she had thought about what she was doing and whether it made sense, and concluded, as she always did, that it probably did not make sense, and she was going to do it anyway. She arrived at FOB Ridgecrest just after 7 in the morning. The base sat in a long valley between 2 ridge lines, the kind of terrain that looks peaceful in photographs and feels exposed the moment you are standing in it. Temporary structures, most of them prefab units and converted containers, arranged in a grid that suggested organization but had clearly evolved over time, adding pieces as needed, adjusting the plan to match reality on the ground. Snow covered everything: the roof lines, the equipment, the vehicle park. Under 6 inches of new snow, the base looked almost clean. Almost. Nora parked, killed the engine, and sat for a moment. From the driver's seat, she could see the north perimeter fence. Beyond it, the ridgeline rose sharply, pine trees heavy with accumulated snow, rock faces pushing through where the slope was too steep to hold soil. Elevation roughly 400 feet above the valley floor. The trees thinned near the top, opening into broken terrain of boulders and exposed granite. The distance registered. The angle registered. The way the morning light was coming in low from the east, which would put a shooter on the north ridge looking into shadow for another 2 hours at least, that registered too. She got out of the car. The air hit immediately, that specific quality of high-altitude winter that finds every gap in your clothing and settles there, patient and permanent. Her breath came out white. Her boots broke through the surface crust with each step. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the gate. Corporal Brett Linden was at the gate. He was 22 years old and looked younger, the kind of young face that military haircuts make look younger still. His eyes were red at the edges from an overnight watch, and he had the slightly unfocused quality of a man running on caffeine and stubbornness. He looked at her paperwork the way tired people look at things they are required to look at, present but not engaged. His eyes moved across the page, and he stamped it and handed it back. "Captain Kessel is in the command trailer," he said. "3rd building past the fuel depot." "I know where it is," Nora said. She did. She had studied the base layout from satellite imagery before making the drive. She had cross-referenced it against terrain maps for the surrounding ridge lines. noted the distances between structures, the spacing of defensive positions, the placement of the fuel depot relative to the main access road. Old habit, one she had never managed to break. Lyndon watched her walk away with the mild curiosity of someone who has very little else to do, then went back to his coffee. The snow crunched under her boots. Morning light turned the compound pale blue, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly unreal, slightly temporary. She passed two soldiers carrying a fuel line toward one of the Humvees. She passed a satellite dish mounted on a pole, its alignment slightly off, she could tell from the angle. She passed three sensor units mounted on posts along the inner perimeter. One had its housing cracked, exposing the circuitry to the elements. Ice had been working into the mechanism for what looked like at least 2 days. She kept walking. She kept seeing. The command trailer was where the satellite photos had told her it would be. She pushed the door open without knocking. Grant was at the radio console, his back to her, adjusting frequency dials with the careful precision of a man who had been fighting the same equipment problem for a long time. The trailer smelled like burned coffee and cold metal. A weather report was running from a small speaker in the corner, the volume too low to make out the words. She stood in the doorway and watched him work for a moment. He did not hear her enter. He was focused on the console jaw, tight turning a dial by increments and listening to the result. There was a crack in the corner of the window where condensation had frozen and expanded, and someone had taped over it with duct tape that was already starting to peel at one edge. The overhead light buzzed faintly. The backup battery readout on the panel read 38%. "That frequency's still giving you trouble," she said. He turned fast. The surprise moved across his face in sequence, shock first, then recognition, then something warmer that settled into a real smile. Nora. He crossed the small space and pulled her close. He smelled like he always smelled in the field. Instant coffee and cold metal, and something underneath that was just him. "I thought you weren't coming until next week." "Got the dates mixed up," she said. She had not gotten the dates mixed up. She had moved the trip forward after 3 weeks of watching regional activity reports that she technically had no access to, but had never stopped knowing how to access. Something in the pattern had shifted. Nothing dramatic, no single data point that would have meant anything in isolation. But the accumulation of small things, the frequency of sensor anomalies along the North Ridge, approaches a brief disruption in the relay station's uplink that lasted 40 minutes on a clear day with no listed cause. A report from a rancher 40 miles north about unfamiliar vehicles on a fire road that should have had no traffic. Small things. The kind of things that taken together meant something to someone who had spent 8 years learning how to read them. She had not shared this analysis with Grant. She had simply moved her trip up and told him she had gotten the dates wrong. Grant pulled back and studied her face. His own face had that field-worn quality she had learned to read over 8 years of marriage, dark circles gray, coming in at the edges of his stubble, the particular tightness around the eyes that came from too many nights of inadequate sleep. He was 43 and looked older in this light. Not because he was failing. He was not. He was one of the strongest men she had ever known, but because the work did this to people over time. It always left marks. "You look tired," he said. 6-hour drive. "You look worse than 6 hours." She unwound her scarf and draped it over the back of a chair. "So do you." He laughed and pointed at the coffee maker. "It's terrible. Want some?" "Yes." While he poured, she moved to the radio console and let her eyes run over the equipment. Backup battery at 38%. Antenna cable with stress fractures in the insulation near the connection point, the kind that came from repeated temperature cycling, freezing, and thawing over many winters. The emergency frequency card taped to the wall above the console, the tape on the upper right corner, losing its adhesion, curling away. "Where's your secondary radio?" she asked. He handed her a cup. "Supply shed. Been pulling parts from it." One radio. If it failed during an incident, they were blind, and everyone inside this compound would know it before they could do anything about it. "How long have the perimeter sensors been malfunctioning?" she asked. He looked at her. "Drummond thinks it's wildlife. Snow accumulation on the housing's false readings. We've had it before." "How many are actually functioning right now?" Grant was quiet for a moment. 4 out of 7. Nora looked at the coffee in her cup. 4 out of 7 sensors. 1 radio, a satellite link that dropped during shift changes. 27 soldiers stationed here for border monitoring on long shifts, watching screens, counting days. "I know," Grant said, reading her silence the way only 8 years of marriage allows. "I've submitted 3 maintenance requests in the last 2 months. What came back?" "Acknowledgement of receipt." She nodded and drank her terrible coffee. She walked the perimeter after lunch, hands in her jacket pockets, moving at the unhurried pace of a bored spouse killing time. 3 soldiers she passed nodded politely. One asked if she needed directions. She thanked him and said she was fine. Her eyes worked the whole time. The spacing between defensive positions was too wide for the number of personnel available inevitable, given the head count, but a problem if you needed to hold a line under real pressure. The sight lines from the North Ridge were clean and unobstructed across the entire upper third of the compound. Snow accumulation along the east fence had created a blind spot approximately 60 feet long where the sensor posts were buried to their mounting brackets. She stopped near the sensor units she had noticed from the road, 3 of them visible from here. The one with the cracked housing had ice working into the circuitry. Whatever it was reporting, it was not accurate. The sensor at the northeast corner of the inner perimeter had a different problem. Its mounting post had shifted in the frozen ground, tilting the unit approximately 15 degrees off its original orientation. It was now covering a patch of sky rather than the approach corridor it had been positioned to monitor. She looked at the approach corridor the sensor was supposed to cover. Then she looked at the North Ridge. The ridge dominated the view from anywhere in the compound, 400 feet of elevation. Dense pine cover up to about the 2/3 mark, then open rock and boulder fields to the top. From up there, you could see every building, every defensive position, every vehicle. You could count heads. You could map movement patterns. You could, if you were patient and knew what you were looking for, build a complete picture of a base's operational rhythms over 48 hours of careful observation. The thought arrived the way it always did, not as a choice but as a calculation, cold and fast and professional. She walked away from the sensor post. Sergeant Wes Drummond found her outside the mess hall, or she found him, it was hard to say which, because they arrived at the corner of the building from different directions at approximately the same moment, and both stopped. He was 35, built like someone who had spent years carrying weight, not bulky, but dense with the economy of movement that combat experience produced in men who had learned that unnecessary motion cost energy they might need later. His name tape read Drummond. His eyes were doing the same thing to her that hers had been doing to the compound all morning. Reading. "Mrs. Kessel," he said. "Drummond." She offered her hand. He shook it. His grip was calibrated firm, but not testing. "How long have you been posted here?" 4 months. "Quiet posting." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "Mostly." She looked toward the North Ridge. The wind had shifted in the last hour, pushing snow off the upper tree line in thin, horizontal curtains. "The sensor anomalies," she said. "How often?" He went still in the way that careful men go still when a conversation moves somewhere they did not anticipate. "Excuse me. The perimeter sensors. False readings from the North Quadrant." A pause. He was deciding something. 3 times in the last 5 days. 11 p.m., 2 a.m., 4:40 in the morning. 3 times, all North Quadrant. 11-2, 4:40. Same sensor cluster each time. 2 out of 3 readings from the northeast corner unit. The one with the tilted mounting post. The one now pointing at sky instead of the approach corridor it was supposed to monitor. "Thank you," she said. Drummond watched her for a moment longer than courtesy required. "Captain Kessel said you came up early. Got the dates mixed up." "That's right." He nodded slowly. "Long drive in winter to visit for a couple days." She met his eyes. He was not accusing her of anything. He was noting that the math was unusual and unusual things deserved to be noted. She respected that about him immediately. "Enjoy your afternoon, Sergeant," she said. She walked north. The boot prints were at the base of the ridge, in the area between the outer perimeter fence and the first tree line, technically outside the base boundary, accessible from the approach road or from the ridge above. She found them by following the gap in the sensor coverage, the 60-foot blind spot along the east fence where accumulated snow had buried the posts. She almost walked past them. The overnight snowfall had covered most of the tracks. What remained were shallow depressions, barely holding their shape against the surface crust, enough to tell you something had been there, not quite enough to tell you what. An untrained eye would have seen irregularities in the snow. A rancher might have assumed deer. Nora crouched down. The depressions were too regular. The spacing was consistent, not perfectly so, but within the range that came from a person moving at a deliberate pace, placing their feet with care to minimize noise and impression depth. The pattern suggested 2 people moving in a staggered line, the second person partially stepping in the first person's tracks to reduce the visible count. She looked at the angle of approach. They had come from the northeast, following the base of the ridge, where shadow would have kept them out of the ambient light from the compound. They had stopped here. The snow was more compressed, weight held in place rather than moving through for approximately 15 to 20 minutes. Then they had gone back the way they came. From this position, crouching in the shadow of the fence line, you had a clean view of the motor pool, the fuel depot, the command trailer, and the main defensive positions along the north perimeter. You could count the guard change intervals. You could watch the pattern of lights in the buildings after dark. You could build over 2 or 3 nights of patient observation a complete operational picture. She stood up. She looked at the sky. The color was wrong, not the clean blue of an established high-pressure system, but the pale, compressed white of a sky holding something back. Weather coming in, the temperature had already dropped 6 degrees since her arrival. Whatever the forecast said, the sky was making its own plans. This had been planned, not opportunistic, not random. Someone had been here watching for at least 2 nights before today. The sensor malfunctions had not been coincidence, or if they had started as one, someone had identified them as an advantage and built around them. The satellite link disruptions, the shift change timing, the specific placement of observation in the gap between sensor coverage. This was not wildlife. She walked back to the command trailer and told Grant what she had found. She used the careful language of a concerned spouse with general military awareness, rather than the specific language of someone who had spent 8 years learning precisely this kind of threat identification. He listened. He took it seriously. He radioed it up, the chain of command, increased the watch rotation, and asked Drummond to run a manual check of the perimeter fence line before the afternoon shift change. It was the right response. Thorough, professional, appropriate. It was not enough. The afternoon moved slowly. More burned coffee, a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and salt. Grant talked about the maintenance requests, the equipment failures, the satellite link problems, with the tone of a man managing too many issues with too few resources. She listened and asked questions and said the things that needed to be said. She watched the clock. Drummond came back from the perimeter check at 12:50 and reported nothing unusual. He said it with the tone of a man reporting what he had found rather than what he believed, and she caught the distinction. At 13:20, the satellite link dropped again. At 13:35, Nora's left hand under the table where no one could see it, pressed flat against her thigh and stayed there. She had done the calculation. She had checked it twice the way she always checked it twice. The North Ridge was the overwatch position, the only place from which you could control fire across the entire compound simultaneously. South Ridge was lower, partially exposed, but it offered an angle on the North Ridge that nothing inside the compound could match. The shelf she had spotted at half elevation on the south face, a line of shadows suggesting a horizontal break in the rock seen from the vehicle park at 9:40 that morning, was approximately 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide. Enough to work from. Barely enough, but enough. Distance from the south shelf to the anticipated machine gun position on the North Ridge, approximately 620 to 640 yards depending on exact placement. Workable. She had made harder shots in worse conditions with less preparation. She did not let herself think about what would happen after. The conversation that would come. The things that would need to be explained and the things that could not be explained even with unlimited time and the best intentions. She had kept her past behind a door for 8 years, and today that door was going to come off its hinges entirely, and she would deal with that after. She thought about the North Ridge instead. She thought about distance and elevation and wind. At 13:40, the first explosion tore through the quiet afternoon air, and the chain-link fence along the north perimeter folded back like paper, and Brett Linden went down in the snow. And Nora Kessel looked south toward the ridge and began to move. The world changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The first explosion hit the north perimeter, and the sound of it was not the sound you expected if you had only heard explosions in movies. It was not a boom. It was a concussive crack that seemed to originate inside your chest rather than outside it, a physical force that compressed the air and rattled the mess hall windows and sent every loose object skittering sideways simultaneously. Plastic trays, coffee cups, a deck of cards someone had left on a corner table. Everything moved at once, and then the lights flickered and the country music from the small radio speaker stopped mid-note, and for one full second, nobody in the mess hall moved. That second ended. Grant was already up, already moving toward the door, already reaching for his rifle where it leaned against the wall before most of the soldiers at the other tables had processed what they were hearing. That was the thing about men who had spent enough years doing this kind of work. Their bodies responded before their minds finished forming the question. "Contact north," he said. "Everyone to positions." The mess hall emptied in controlled urgency. Not panic, these were trained men, but the specific energy of people who had rehearsed this enough times to know where they were going and not quite enough times to make the fear disappear entirely. Helmets grabbed, weapons collected, boots on packed snow. Nora came through the door behind them and stopped. The north fence was already compromised. A section of chain link 30 feet wide had been torn inward. The metal curled back in both directions from a central point. Black smoke rose from the breach, and through the smoke came the sound of sustained automatic fire, the rhythmic hammer of a belt-fed weapon working through a long burst, and beneath that the flatter crack of precision rifle fire from multiple points up the ridge. She stood just outside the mess hall door, and she read the attack the way she had been trained to read it, the way you cannot unlearn once it has been put into you deeply enough. 3 points of origin. She could hear the distinction clearly even through the noise and the wind. The heavy weapon was high on the ridge northeast face, firing in controlled bursts. 8 rounds. Pause. 8 rounds. The pause was for cooling or for the gunner to scan and reacquire. Below it and to the left, 2 rifle teams working in coordination, one suppressing while the other adjusted position. They were maneuvering, not static, which meant they had a plan and they were executing it. Drone sounds came 30 seconds after the first explosion. 3 quadcopters appearing through the smoke above the north fence line, hovering at 40 feet, cameras angled down. Reconnaissance, targeting coordination. Possibly both. Grant was at the command trailer now, fighting with the radio. Switching frequencies, switching again, his face tight with controlled frustration. He looked up and saw her standing in the open. Nora, get to the bunker. South side, now. She did not move toward the bunker. She was watching the pattern of fire, the timing of the bursts, the way the 2 rifle teams below the heavy weapon were operating in a specific rotation, one moving while the other maintained contact, then switching. It was an efficient pattern. Clean. The kind of thing that came from either very good training or very specific instruction. The motor pool erupted. One of the Humvees became a pillar of fire and black smoke that rose straight until the wind caught it and tore it sideways across the compound. A mortar round hit the east corner of the mess hall. The roof section sagged and then collapsed inward. Grant came toward her, grabbing her arm. Did you hear me? The bunker. They're gonna push you east, she said. They're pinning you at the north fence, and they'll send a team around the fuel depot on your right flank. The heavy weapon covers the center, so you can't reposition in time. They may already be moving. He stared at her face. She watched him run the calculation, check it against what he was seeing, find that it held. He turned and called across the compound to Drummond with the correct tactical language, and Drummond responded immediately, 2 men peeling off toward the east perimeter without hesitation. 40 seconds later, those 2 men made contact with a flanking team of 3 who had come around the back of the fuel depot exactly where Nora had said they would be. Grant came back to her. The smoke was thickening. One of the drones dropped a canister, producing red smoke, adding to the visual confusion. The incoming fire from the north was intensifying. Nora. His voice had changed, something more careful underneath it. How did you know about the east flank? She looked at the north ridge. The heavy weapon fired again. She counted the burst. 8 rounds. Pause. The timing of the pause before the barrel change was consistent. She had been counting since the first minute. There are things I haven't told you, she said, about who I was before we met. He waited. Around them, the compound was contracting, soldiers falling back to secondary positions, the defensive perimeter pulling inward, the sound of combat moving closer as the attackers exploited the breach. I was a Marine Scout sniper, she said. 8 years, 2 deployments. I left 8 years ago, and right now what is happening on that ridge is something I can address, but I need you to take me to the armory. He did not say anything for 3 full seconds. She watched his face move through something complex and difficult, and on the other side of it, he said, "Come with me." The armory was a converted shipping container, steel walls, combination lock, a single overhead bulb. Grant worked the lock and pulled the door. The smell of oil and cold metal came out ahead of him. She found the M110 on the 3rd rack. Stripped down, scope mount, empty bipod, gone backup sights, pulled for parts. But the barrel was intact. She checked the bore by angling it toward the light. Clean. The bolt cycled smoothly. The trigger broke cleanly on the dry fire. The mechanism was sound. Your personal scope, she said. The Leupold Mark V. The one in your desk drawer. He went still. I've known about it for 4 years, she said. I didn't say anything because you hadn't said anything. Go get it. He left. She used the time to pull magazines, check each one, load 3 of them into her jacket pockets. 20 rounds per magazine. She would need to be careful. She would need to make every shot mean something. Drummond appeared in the armory doorway, breathing hard. He stopped when he saw her with the rifle. His eyes moved across her hands, the way she held the weapon, the way her body had already oriented itself around it. Men who have spent years around firearms can read other people's relationship to them, the same way musicians hear the difference between someone who has played for a month and someone who has played for a decade. It is in the handling. It is in the unconscious ease of it. He saw it. USMC, Scout Sniper, she said before he could speak. 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, 8 years, 2 deployments. There is an Overwatch position on the North Ridge coordinating this entire assault, and if I reach the South Ridge shelf, I have an angle on it that nothing inside this compound currently has. Drummond looked at the rifle, looked at her face. 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, he said slowly. Fallujah, 2nd battle. Yes. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then what do you need from me? Grant came back with the scope case. Hard shell latches, the Mark V inside 10 power fixed magnification. Not ideal for the range she needed, but workable. She mounted it in under 90 seconds, the movement so deeply embedded in her hands that she did not think about the sequence. Tighten, level, tighten again. The South Ridge shelf, she said, halfway up the rock face. I can get there, but I need attention off the south side. Sustained fire toward the North Ridge, loud. Starts in 4 minutes. Drummond looked at Grant. Grant nodded once. 4 minutes, Drummond said, and he left at a run. Grant stood in the armory doorway. The firelight from the burning Humvee was painting the left side of his face, orange and shadow. He looked at her, and she could see him putting together 8 years of small moments and half answers and strategic deflections, and she could see it hitting him in the way that things hit you when they are true and too large to absorb all at once. 8 years, he said. I know. You were a Marine Scout sniper for 8 years, and you never... I wanted to be someone else. She shouldered the rifle, checked the magazine seating. I wanted to be just Nora, not whatever I was before. And then more time passed, and it became harder to introduce the other thing without it becoming everything. He crossed the space between them and took her face in both hands. His palms were cold. She could feel him trembling very slightly. Not fear, but the physical weight of something too large for the body to hold silently. Come back, he said. I will. Promise me. She looked at him. She thought about what promises were worth and what they cost, and she said, I promise, because it was true as far as she could make it true, which was the only kind of promise that anyone could honestly make. He let her go. She stepped out into the white chaos and ran south. The run to the base of the South Ridge took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. She moved low and used the smoke for cover, timing her movement between bursts from the heavy weapon on the North Ridge, using the moments when the gunner was scanning rather than firing to cross the open ground. The rifle across her back was heavy. The equipment in her jacket pockets shifted with each stride. Her boots broke through the snow crust, and she could not muffle the sound, and she ran anyway. She reached the base of the rock face and started climbing. The stone was sheeted with ice. The cracks that would have been adequate handholds in warmer conditions were filled solid. She found purchase where she could, wedging her fingers into gaps using friction between her boot soles and the rock face, moving in the slow, careful way of someone who understands that a fall here means everything ends, and so does not fall. 50 feet up, 75. The shelf appeared above her as a dark horizontal line against pale rock. She pulled herself over the lip and lay flat on the cold stone. 10 seconds of nothing except breathing and letting her heart rate come down. She could afford 10 seconds. She could not afford 11. She cleared a working space with her forearm, pushing snow back from the edge of the shelf. Settled into position, rifle forward, and raised the spotting scope first. The North Ridge came into focus. Through the smoke and the distance and the moving curtains of wind-driven snow, she found the heavy weapon position by following sound. The gunner was behind a fallen tree that had come down parallel to the slope, creating a natural barricade. White parka face-wrapped equipment, professional grade. The weapon was a belt-fed variant by the rate of fire, and the burst pattern, and she assessed it as a modified M249 configuration. Sustained fire on that barrel meant heat buildup was inevitable. He would need to change it. She watched him through 2 complete cycles. 8 rounds, pause. 8 rounds, she counted the pause between cycles. 12 seconds. Consistent. He was checking barrel temperature, every second cycle keeping the weapon within safe operating parameters. She moved to the rifle teams, 2 of them on the mid-ridge working the rotation she had identified from the compound. Below them, nearer the tree line, the flanking element that Drummond's people had already engaged on the east side. The drones were still up, repositioning between their smoke drops, operating on what was clearly a pre-planned pattern. All of it pre-planned. She ranged the heavy weapon position, 630 yards. Wind from the northwest at approximately 15 miles per hour with gusts running higher. Temperature minus 12 Celsius and dropping. She calculated bullet drop for the range. Wind drift for a 168 grain match round at that distance in those conditions. Cold air density, which increased the bullet's time in flight and amplified every other variable. The number she arrived at was one she trusted. She had arrived at it in training and in the field, and in the years between in the back of her mind, where the old calculations ran whether she wanted them to or not. She adjusted the scope. 3 MOA elevation, 1.5 right for the wind. Below the compound's south side, Drummond's squad opened up. Heavy suppressive fire directed at the north ridge, loud sustained pulling attention. A saw alongside rifle fire, the combined volume filling the valley and demanding every head on the north ridge turn toward it. The gunner behind the fallen tree shifted position to reorient his fire. He reached for the barrel assembly to begin the change. Nora controlled her breathing in the way she had done 10,000 times before. In through the nose. The natural respiratory pause. The crosshairs drifted with her heartbeat, and she let them drift and found the rhythm, and in the space between beats, she pressed through the trigger. The rifle bucked. The report cracked across the valley. Through the scope, she saw the impact. The gunner jerked backward. The M249 tilted sideways on its mount. He slumped over the weapon and was still. She worked the bolt, chambered the next round. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. She had resented that for 8 years, the hands that did not shake even when the rest of her was breaking. The rifle teams on the mid-ridge had frozen. Their overwatch was down, and they did not know where the shot had come from. The south ridge was not a direction anyone had planned to defend against. She could see the confusion in their movement, looking at each other rather than scanning for threat, the rotation broken. She found the second target, mid-ridge left team. The lead shooter had stood up slightly, craning his neck to see what had happened to the position above him. A natural human impulse. The last impulse he acted on. Range 610 yards. Same wind, slight downward angle adjustment. She pressed the trigger. The shooter went down. Now they knew. The remaining members of both rifle teams began moving, breaking cover, scrambling for new positions. Their clean rotation was gone. She could see it in the way they moved, no longer tactical but reactive, which was a different and more desperate thing. She shifted 15 feet east along the shelf. New angle. Better sight line on the lower element near the tree line. 4 shooters behind a rock outcrop. One of them was on a radio, pressing the handset against his ear, talking fast. The others were scanning the ridges around them, weapons up, trying to locate the source of the fire that had taken 2 of their people. She looked at the man on the radio. She looked at the way he was standing. The way his left shoulder dropped slightly when he pressed the handset to his ear. The way his right foot turned out at a slightly more pronounced angle than average. The way he held his rifle in his left hand, not the standard grip, but a modified hold that kept the stock slightly higher against the body. She had seen that grip before. She had created that grip. Not from a manual, it did not exist in any manual. She had developed it as a modification for left-handed shooters transitioning to right-handed field operation, and she had taught it in a classroom at Quantico in 2014 to a cohort of 12 students, and she had written in her final evaluation report that one of those students was the most gifted trainee she had encountered in 8 years of instruction. Victor Crane. She did not move for 2 full seconds. The scope was still the crosshair centered, and she looked at the man on the radio, and she knew with the certainty of someone who had spent years learning to read people through a scope that it was him. The physical signature was unmistakable to her. She had watched him fire 10,000 rounds in 6 months. She knew the way he occupied space with a weapon in his hand. He had been her student. He had been the best student she had ever taught. He was commanding this attack. She pressed the trigger. The bullet caught him center mass. He went forward, and the radio fell into the snow, and he did not get up. The 3 remaining shooters scattered. She tracked the closest one, led him by the calculated margin, and fired. The round kicked up snow 2 feet ahead of him. She adjusted, cycled, the bolt fired again. This time the bullet found him. Below the ridge she could hear the change. Drummond's voice carrying across the compound. The sound of defenders moving forward rather than holding. The pressure had reversed. The initiative had shifted. She put a round through the targeting sight of a mortar specialist trying to set up a tube at the tree line. The equipment exploded out of his hands and he dove sideways and left the tube in the snow and did not return for it. The attack was collapsing. Without the overwatch, without the radio operator, without the coordinated rotation of the rifle teams, the attackers were becoming individuals instead of a unit. And individuals without coordination against the defending force that had recovered its footing did not have favorable mathematics. Someone made the call to withdraw. She could see it in the way movement changed, pulling back in groups of 2 and 3 toward the far side of the North Ridge, away from the compound, away from the exposure. She let them go. She fired twice more at specific threats, and then she held. Her job was not to kill everyone. It was to break the attack. The attack was broken. The last burst of fire from the North Ridge came at 13:58. Then silence. Not peaceful silence. The silence of a place that had been loud and was now processing what it had been through ringing ears and clearing smoke and men checking themselves for wounds they had not had time to feel. But it was silence, and silence meant the exchange of fire had ended, and that meant something significant had changed. Nora stayed in position for 5 additional minutes. She glassed the North Ridge systematically, working right to left, checking every position she had identified. 2 were occupied by men who were down and not moving. The rest were empty. She checked the approaches from the ridge to the compound. Nothing moving toward them. She began her descent. The climb down was harder than the climb up. It always was. Her hands had gone cold enough that she had to concentrate on maintaining grip, and the ice had not improved in the time she had been on the shelf. She moved carefully and reached the ground without incident. She walked back across the compound with the rifle in her hands, no longer making any pretense about what it was or what she had been doing with it. The soldiers she passed stopped and looked at her. Some said nothing. Some said things she did not fully register. She was already accounting, 7 confirmed. 2 misses, both corrected on the following shot. One position she had not been able to address, the drone operators who had withdrawn with the others. One man she had shot with the full knowledge of who he was. That last item sat in her chest like a stone, and she carried it across the snow, and she did not let it show on her face because there was nothing useful to be done with it yet. Grant met her at the edge of the secondary line. His face was cut on the left side shrapnel, or a concrete chip, and the blood had dried in a dark line from his cheekbone to his jaw. He looked at her and then at the rifle, and then at the North Ridge where the smoke was thinning in the wind. "How many?" he said. 7 confirmed. He absorbed that, said nothing for a moment. Drummond came from the east side of the compound, moving quickly, a piece of equipment in one hand. He set it down on top of a concrete barrier where they could all see it. A communications unit, military-grade, compact, ruggedized, the kind not available through commercial channels. He had pulled it from the position near the fuel depot where the flanking team had been stopped. "There's more of it," he said, "at the North Breach Point. Same manufacturer, same configuration." He looked at Grant steadily. "This is not foreign equipment, sir. I know what this is. I have used this. This is American military issue. Encrypted to a protocol not available outside the department." He paused. "Somebody on the inside provided this equipment to whoever just attacked us." The 3 of them stood around the unit in the thinning smoke and said nothing for a long moment. All of that was true, and all of it needed to be addressed. But first, Grant Kessel looked at the equipment on the concrete barrier, and then he looked at his wife, and the question on his face was not about the equipment at all. The Chinook came in low over the South Ridge at 1620, its rotors beating the air into a white chaos that flattened the snow in expanding rings and sent loose equipment skittering across the compound. Then a second one behind it. They settled in the open ground near the vehicle park, and the crew chiefs were out before the wheels fully touched, already moving toward the aid station with equipment and purpose. Nora stood at the edge of the compound and watched them come. The medical crew moved the wounded first. 7 of them on stretchers loaded with the efficient care of people who had done this before and knew exactly how much time each step required. Nora watched each one go. She cataloged injuries without wanting to. Drummond with a deep laceration across his left forearm, already field-dressed. 3 others with wounds that looked manageable in daylight and might reveal themselves as more complicated once the adrenaline cleared. 2 who needed surgical intervention within hours. Then they brought out the 3 who were not wounded. Body bags are a specific shade of black that exists in no other context. You recognize it immediately and completely the first time you see it, and you never stop recognizing it afterward. 3 of them laid in a line in the snow while the crew chiefs coordinated the loading sequence. Brett Linden had been the first one down. He had been 22 years old and had looked younger and had been red-eyed from an overnight watch, and had barely looked at her paperwork when she signed in that morning. She let herself remember that. She let it be specific and sharp-edged, rather than smoothing it into something manageable, because some debts you do not get to reduce by processing them into abstraction. Grant came and stood beside her. He had a field dressing on the cut along his cheekbone. He was still in his jacket, hands in his pockets, watching the loading with the expression of a commander who has learned to keep the accounting separate from the moment, because the moment requires function and the accounting requires time and stillness that the moment does not provide. They stood together and did not speak until the Chinooks lifted off and the sound of the rotors faded north, and the compound settled back into a quiet that felt different from the quiet that had preceded the attack. More honest somehow, more aware of what quiet actually cost. Inside, Grant said. They used the supply shed, which was intact and had a working heater and 2 chairs. Someone had left a thermos on the shelf near the door. Grant checked it, real coffee, not the burned instant from the command trailer probably left by the flight crew. He poured 2 cups and handed one to her and sat down, and she sat across from him, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. The heater ticked. Wind moved against the walls outside. 8 years married, he said finally. Every conversation we've had about your time before we met, every time you deflected when I asked about the years before, you were in. Yes. Scout sniper, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. Yes. Drummond looked it up while you were on the ridge. Less than 300 active duty at any given time. Most selective program in the Corps. He looked up at her. And you came home from that, and you met me at a dinner party, and you told me you had worked as a technical consultant for the military, and you let me believe that for 8 years. The heater ticked. I wanted to be done with it, she said. I wanted to be someone who wasn't that. When I met you, I didn't know how to introduce the other thing without it becoming everything. So I left it out. And then more time passed, and it became harder. Not easier. Harder. Because by then you knew me as the person I was trying to become, and I didn't know how to show you the person I had been without changing what you thought of the person you knew. You changed what I thought anyway, just not until today. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I found the file in 2020. She went still. Your service record, he said. Your evaluation reports. The photographs. Your personnel file from Quantico, including your final assessment of the 2015 training cohort. He looked at her steadily. I found it in the safe in the study. You had left the door open. I don't know if that was accidental. She did not know either. She had thought about that safe door more than once over the years, and had never arrived at a satisfying answer about whether leaving it open had been a mistake or a choice she had made below the level of conscious decision. I read everything, he said. I sat in the study for 2 hours and I read your entire service record. Then I closed the safe and I put the combination back, and I never mentioned it. The silence that followed this had weight and texture. It had 5 years of accumulated consequence inside it. Why, she said. He looked at the wall for a moment. Because you had worked so hard to be someone else. I could see it in how carefully you never talked about certain things. How you changed the subject when military history came up in a specific way. How you knew things you shouldn't have known and then caught yourself and backed away from them. He paused. I loved who you were trying to be. I thought if I brought it out into the open, you would feel like you couldn't be her anymore. So I left it alone. Nora looked at her husband of 8 years and understood something she should perhaps have understood before, which was that the distance she had felt between them, the sense of holding something back, the slight gap that never quite closed, no matter how much time passed, had not been one-sided. They had both been maintaining it. From opposite directions, for reasons each of them believed were generous, they had been keeping the same space open between them. We've been protecting each other from the same thing, she said. Yes. And it didn't work. No, it didn't work. She set down her cup. There's something else I need to tell you, she said, about why I left. He waited. She had told this story before, but only to herself in the version that lived inside her head. She had never said it out loud to another person. She had come close twice, once to a counselor she had seen briefly after her discharge, once on an evening 2 years into their marriage when Grant had asked directly about her deployments, and she had said enough to satisfy the surface of the question without touching the bottom of it. There was a target, she said, high value. We had been tracking him for 4 months. The intelligence was solid. The chain of command had approved the operation. My spotter and I had been in position for 11 hours. She looked at her hands. I had the shot. Clean line, good conditions, inside my confident range. Everything said take it. But you didn't, Grant said. He was holding a child, his daughter. We found out later she was 7 years old. He was using her deliberately. He knew exactly what he was doing, but she was there and I could not take the shot without the probability of hitting her. So you let him go. My spotter told me to take it anyway. Said the mission priority outweighed the collateral risk. We argued for about 90 seconds, which is a very long time when you are on the radio with superior officers asking for status. She paused. I let him go. I reported that conditions had changed and the shot was no longer viable, which was technically a false report, and my spotter filed a supplemental that told the truth. There was an investigation. It was resolved in my favor officially because the rules of engagement supported my decision. But he killed 17 people 8 days later. A checkpoint bombing 40 miles from where we had him in the scope. 17 people who drove up to that checkpoint and never drove away from it. She was quiet for a moment. I know the analysis. I know what the intelligence people said afterward, that there was no guarantee eliminating him would have prevented the attack, that networks adapt, that one man's death does not end a campaign. I know all of that, and I believe most of it, and it does not change the specific weight of the number 17. Grant reached across and put his hand over hers. That's why you left, he said. I couldn't reconcile it. I couldn't find the right answer. There wasn't one. And if there wasn't a right answer, I didn't know how to keep doing the job. The job requires you to believe there is a correct calculation. Once I stopped believing that I couldn't make the calculations anymore. And today, she looked out the single small window of the supply shed. The storm was clearing from the southwest, deep blue pushing through behind the retreating weather. Today the math was clear, she said. I knew it going up the ridge, 23 people behind me, clear threat in front of me. No children in the scope. She paused. It's never easy. I want to be clear about that. It is never easy, and it shouldn't be. But today, it was clear. There's a difference, Grant said, between easy and clear. Yes, there is. He held her hand for a moment longer. Then Drummond knocked on the shed door and opened it, and his face was doing something complicated that she recognized as the expression of a man about to deliver information he was not entirely sure how to frame. We found one of them, he said. He's alive. He was in the equipment shed on the east side of the compound, sitting against the interior wall with his back straight in the careful way of someone managing significant pain by keeping still. The wound was in his left side below the rib cage, an exit wound, which was better than the alternative, but the blood loss had been significant before Drummond's people found him and applied a field dressing. His color was not good. His eyes were steady anyway. He looked up when Nora came through the door. Victor Crane was 34 years old, which made him 6 years younger than her. She had met him when he was 23, a second lieutenant with evaluation scores nearly unprecedented in the program's history. She had watched him work for 6 months and had written in her final assessment that he possessed the rarest combination the work required, the precision and the patience and the cold functional clarity under pressure, and had recommended him without reservation for the advanced program. She had not seen him since. He looked at her now with eyes that were steady despite the pain and the blood loss, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who understand each other's capabilities and are taking each other's measure. Sergeant Mercer, he said finally, the old rank, deliberate, a form of acknowledgement of what they had both been and how they had known each other. Crane, he looked at the wall across from him. 8 shots from the south shelf, I counted. 7 confirmed. 8 shots. You adjusted after the 7th. I tracked the round by watching the snow displacement. A pause. You taught me how to do that. He looked at her directly. I didn't know you were here. I know. If I had known, I would not have taken this contract. That is not a thing I say to make you feel differently about what happened. It is simply true. She sat down on a crate across from him. Tell me what this was. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he chose his words with the precision she had always recognized in him. I was contracted to conduct an intelligence assessment of this installation. Vulnerability mapping, communication thresholds, defensive response times, perimeter integrity under stress conditions. He paused. The contracting brief specified that the assessment required realistic operational conditions to generate valid data. The client wanted to know exactly how this base would perform under genuine pressure, not simulated pressure. Genuine pressure. Who authorized live ammunition against an active installation? The client provided documentation indicating this installation had been designated for strategic review at the departmental level and that all personnel on site had been read in under a classified exercise protocol. The documentation was detailed. The authorization chain was complete, going from the contracting office through 3 intermediate levels to a signatory I recognized as legitimate. His jaw tightened slightly. I verified what I was able to verify. The documentation held up. But the installation had not been notified. No, there was no exercise protocol. The authorization documentation was either falsified or it represented a decision made above the level of notification, someone who had the authority to authorize this and made the deliberate choice not to inform your husband's command. He looked at her steadily. 3 people are dead because someone made that choice. I accepted a contract based on documentation I was given, and I bear responsibility for not investigating further. I'm not attempting to place all of it elsewhere, but the person who provided falsified or incomplete authorization carries the larger portion. Nora sat with that for a moment. She thought about the equipment Drummond had found. American military grade. Encryption protocol available only within the department. The contractor had not sourced that equipment independently. Someone had provided it along with documentation sufficient to satisfy a professional who knew what adequate documentation looked like. Someone in the system had looked at FOB Ridgecrest at its degraded sensors, its single radio, its one functional Humvee, its maintenance requests, that came back as acknowledgement of receipt and had seen not a problem requiring resources, but an asset requiring assessment. Had decided that 27 soldiers living and working inside this compound were suitable subjects for a live fire intelligence evaluation and had signed the paperwork and had not told a single one of them what was coming. 3 of those 27 would not go home. The client, she said, you have the contracting chain. Everything, he said. The contracting office, 4 intermediate steps, the name and position of the signatory who provided the final authorization, the sourcing documentation for the equipment, the original operational brief. He met her eyes. I will give all of it to whoever you need me to give it to. I will give a complete statement as many times as it is required. I will not protect whoever made the decision that put us here. She looked at him for a long moment. She was reading him the way she had always read him, not for threat, which was no longer relevant, but for truth. Crane had been many things in the 6 months she had trained him. He had been demanding and occasionally arrogant and sometimes infuriating in the particular way that exceptionally capable people could be infuriating when they knew they were right. Dishonest had not been among his qualities. He had been the kind of student who would fail an exercise before he would falsify a result, and she had noted it in his evaluations because it was rarer than it should have been. You'll give a full statement, she said. Yes. Everything, the client, the contracting chain, the equipment sourcing, the operational brief, all of it. All of it, he said, every particular. She stood up. Someone will come for your statement within the hour. You'll be transported with the next aircraft. He nodded. Then as she was turning toward the door, how many of the people I brought here came back? She stopped. She thought about what to say and decided that the truth was the only thing she had left to offer. Not all of them, she said. He closed his eyes. She left him with that. Grant was waiting outside. She told him what Crane had told her in the flat, precise language of an operational debrief, the same language she had used for 8 years when the thing she was describing was too significant to survive embellishment. He listened without interrupting. His face moved through several things as she spoke: anger first, then a deep weariness, then the expression of a man who has been failed by the institution he has given his adult life to and is trying to determine whether that failure changes anything fundamental about his relationship to that institution. She thought it probably would not change it. That was both the strength and the limitation of men like Grant Kessel. The institution could fail them, and they would continue to function within it, maintaining their own integrity regardless of what the institution did with that integrity. She had always considered this one of his most admirable qualities. She was also aware it was one of the things that made him vulnerable in ways he did not fully see. I need to write a report, she said when she had finished. A complete one. I know, he said. Everything comes out. What I was, what I did today, Crane's statement, the contracting chain, all of it. I know. It will complicate things for your command. They'll want to know how your wife ended up in a sniper position during an attack on your installation. He looked at her for a long moment. The light was failing in the west now, the brief winter afternoon collapsing toward an early dark, and in that light his face was very clear to her. She could see all of it, the exhaustion and the grief and the complicated love, and the 8 years of maintained distance, and the 5 years of chosen silence about a file in a safe. Write the report, he said. Drummond brought paper. Someone found a working pen. Nora sat at the table in the supply shed and wrote for an hour and 40 minutes in the methodical language of formal military documentation that she had not used in 8 years, and that returned to her immediately and completely the same way the shooting had returned to her, the same way everything from that life returned when the conditions required it. She wrote her name, her rank at time of discharge, her unit, her years of service. She wrote the date and time of her arrival at FOB Ridgecrest and the stated reason for her visit and what she had observed during her initial assessment of the base. She wrote what she had found at the north fence line, the boot prints, the analysis, the report to her husband and his appropriate response. She wrote what had happened at 1340 and what she had done about it and where she had been when she did it and what she had fired and how many times. She wrote what she had recognized through the scope and what she had done about that as well. She wrote it plainly and did not editorialize and did not attempt to contextualize it in a way that reduced its weight. She wrote what Victor Crane had told her. She wrote the names and positions in the contracting chain, the sourcing documentation for the equipment, everything as Crane had given it to her, and she attributed each piece of information to its source clearly and without ambiguity. Grant read it when she was finished. He read it slowly and completely. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name as installation commander and wrote the date and time below his signature. Drummond signed as witness. She brought the statement to Crane separately, and he read it, and he signed it with the hand that was not on the wounded side, and the signature was steady. The report was complete. She gave it to Grant. He would get it into the formal documentation chain through the liaison officer still on site completing his own reports. Where it went after that and what it produced and who it reached and what those people decided to do with it, that was no longer within her control. And she had made her peace with that in the hour and 40 minutes of writing. She had told the truth. The full and specific and professionally documented truth. It was the only thing she had left to offer to the 3 men who had gone home in body bags, and she offered it without qualification. The temperature outside was -17 by the time she had her bag packed. Grant walked her to the car. The sky above the ridges was extraordinary. The storm completely gone, leaving behind the specific clarity of a high-altitude winter night, more stars than seemed possible, the kind of sky that makes the ground below feel very small and very far from everything that usually seems to matter. They stood beside the car. The compound was lit by emergency lighting, the generators running steadily, the base settling into its nighttime routines with the particular resilience of people who do not have the option of not continuing. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. "I know, I wouldn't. I need some time to put this in the right order in my head. The things I knew and the things I didn't know, and the things I chose not to know." "I need that too," she said. He looked at the south ridge. In the dark, it was just a shape against the star-filled sky, a mass of rock and shadow, no indication from here of what it had been 4 hours ago. "You came back," he said. "I told you I would. You've told me a lot of things over 8 years. She met his eyes. "This one I knew I could keep." He pulled her close, and she felt his arms around her, and she felt him trembling, very slightly. The delayed physical response to a day that had moved through multiple kinds of terror, and she held him until it settled. "I'll call you," she said, "when you're ready to talk. I'll know when I'm ready, and when I am, I'll call you." She got in the car. The drive south was quiet, heat on high, radio off. The M110 was in the crate in the trunk wrapped in the emergency blanket from the armory because that was the only thing available to wrap it in. Grant had insisted she take it, not because she needed it, she had managed 8 years without it, but because he understood now that it was part of her, and he was choosing to hold that understanding carefully rather than make her put it somewhere it did not belong. She drove through snow and starlight heading south toward Billings, and the apartment that had felt like enough for 8 years and would feel different now, though she could not yet say exactly how. The roads were clear, the plows had been through. The landscape on both sides of the highway was white and still and absolutely empty under the enormous Montana sky. She thought about Brett Linden, 22 years old, red-eyed from the overnight watch, barely glancing at her paperwork when she signed in. She let herself carry that specifically, not smoothed into abstraction, not processed into something smaller than its actual size. Some things you do not get to reduce. You carry them forward, and you try to make the carrying mean something, which is different from making it mean nothing, and different from pretending it is something other than what it is. She thought about the moment on the shelf when she had recognized Crane through the scope and had not hesitated. She had expected in the years since Fallujah that if she were ever again in a position where a decision of that kind was required, the hesitation would come first. That the failure of nerve she had diagnosed in herself, or the humanity she had diagnosed in herself, depending on how she framed the day, would reassert itself. It had not, because the math today had been clear. Not easy, clear, and she had finally understood somewhere in the 12 minutes on that rock shelf the difference between those two words. Easy meant you did not feel the weight of it. Clear meant you could see which direction to move despite the weight. She had not been without the weight for a single second on that ridge. She had simply been able to see clearly enough to move through it. The miles accumulated behind her. The night deepened. Somewhere south of the last ridgeline, the landscape opened into the wide plains, and the sky became enormous, and the stars doubled and then doubled again until they covered everything. She turned the radio on. The local station was playing something instrumental. Guitar quiet, the kind of music that was not asking anything of her. She left it on. She drove through it and let the miles pass and let the night be what it was. She had been a Marine Scout sniper for 8 years. She had left because she could not find the line between what was right and what the job required, and the not finding had become unbearable. She had built something else, a life that fit differently, a marriage in the middle of it that was real, even when it was incomplete. Today the line had been clear. She knew it would not always be clear. She knew today was not evidence that she had resolved the question that had sent her home 8 years ago. One clear day does not close an open question. It only establishes that the question is still alive, which meant she was still alive inside it, which was perhaps the most honest thing she could say about herself. She drove. What came after was quieter than the day itself, which was the nature of consequence. It rarely announced itself. It arrived in the forms that bureaucratic and human reality produced: paperwork, phone calls, the particular silence of an empty chair at a duty roster where a name had been crossed out. Brett Linden was medically discharged 4 months later. His collarbone healed clean. His hand stopped shaking sometime during the 3rd month of recovery, which the doctors told him was normal, and which he said nothing about one way or the other. He enrolled in law school at the University of Montana the following fall. He did not talk much about FOB Ridgecrest and did not need to. He carried it in the same way that people carry the things that have permanently reorganized their understanding of what a day can contain, which is quietly and without making other people responsible for it. Wes Drummond was recommended for the Bronze Star with Valor by Captain Kessel's formal report, which detailed his tactical leadership during the counterattack with the specific and unembellished language of someone who had watched it happen and wanted the record to be accurate. At the ceremony, Drummond accepted the medal, shook the presenting officer's hand, and drove home. He put it in the same drawer where he kept his other decorations, which he also did not wear because the wearing of medals had never seemed to him to be the point of what the medals were supposed to represent. Grant Kessel was promoted to major 6 months after the incident. He submitted a request to remain posted in the Northern Montana District. The request was approved by a reviewing officer who had read the full report and understood, without stating it explicitly, that Kessel's continued presence in that district was a matter of operational continuity rather than sentiment. Grant did not argue with that framing. It was accurate enough, and he had learned over a long career that accurate enough was frequently the best available outcome. He and Nora talked on the phone for the first time 3 weeks after she drove south. They talked for 2 hours. They talked again the following week and the week after that. The conversations were not easy. They were clear. The investigation into the contracting authorization chain moved at the pace that investigations move when they involve documentation that multiple people have reasons to complicate. It concluded 14 months later with 2 civil proceedings and 1 internal disciplinary review. The names of the parties were not released publicly. The outcome was described in the official summary as appropriate to the findings, which was the kind of language that told people who knew how to read it exactly what had happened and told people who did not know how to read it nothing at all. Victor Crane gave a complete statement. He gave it 3 times to 3 different investigators, and each time the statement is identical in every material particular. What the process produced for him was handled under a classification designation that was not made public. Nora did not ask. She had given what she had to give, and the rest belonged to processes that would function whether or not she was watching them. She was not watching them. She was living in Billings in the apartment that felt different now in ways she was slowly learning to navigate. Different was not worse. Different meant that the door she had kept shut for 8 years was now off its hinges completely, and the room behind it was part of the house she lived in, and she was learning the layout of it, and some mornings she walked through it without difficulty, and some mornings it was harder, and that was the shape of it, and she had stopped being surprised by the shape of it. She drove north on weekends sometimes when the roads were clear. She knew the drive now the way you know a road you have made enough times that your hands remember it without being asked. She drove through the mountains and the enormous sky, and sometimes Grant met her at the gate, and sometimes he was finishing a shift rotation, and she waited in the truck with the heat on, and those waits did not feel like waiting, but like the particular quiet of someone who has learned that the time between things is not empty, but is itself a kind of presence. The South Ridge looked smaller every time she saw it. That was the thing about the places where significant events occurred. They contracted back to their actual dimensions afterward. The shelf was 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide and halfway up a rock face in a Montana valley. It was not dramatic. It was not large. It was just the place where she had made a set of calculations in the cold and acted on them and then climbed back down and kept living. She thought about that sometimes when she drove north. The climbing back down, how it was harder than the climbing up, which was true of most things if you were honest about it, and how you did it anyway because the alternative was staying on the shelf and no one could stay on the shelf. The miles ran south under her tires on the evenings she drove home. The stars came out cold and bright over the plains. She drove through them without looking in the rearview mirror, not because she was afraid of what she would see there, but because she had learned that the road in front of her required more of her attention than the road behind, and she preferred to give her attention where it was most needed. That was the whole of it in the end. You figured out where your attention was most needed, and you put it there, and you kept doing that for as long as you were able. Nora Kessel received no official recognition for her actions at FOB Ridgecrest. No medal was recommended, no citation was filed. Her name appeared in the investigative report in the section describing the events of the day, attributed accurately and without embellishment. That was how she wanted it. That was exactly how she wanted it.